modern life ironic? Something I noticed over the years, and maybe you have too, is that there's a bit of irony in the quality of life that we humans are experiencing. And part of that is this. In many ways, life has improved or become easier. We live in less dangerous times, right? Most of us are not actively engaged in wars, battles, things like this. Yet, the easier life becomes, the more new problems we seem to have, and the more difficult some things become. And maybe at the government, organization, societal, countrywide level, we see these kind of things bubbling up. Employee, job dissatisfaction, burnout, and turnover. People not reproducing enough or too much, as we mentioned. Aging populations, as you mentioned. Pollution, you mentioned. Global warming was also touched upon. Sustainability in general. War. Still, many of these problems are worse these days. And there are a lot of different ones, new ones appearing, like climate change, things like that didn't happen to exist before. Another clue is that we have a thriving self-help industry. These are all things that we've been doing as humans for millions of years, but all of a sudden we need experts to tell us how to do them. So something seems to be wrong. Why are we having so many problems and difficulties? Why do they seem to only be getting worse and not really better with all these improvements that we've been making over the years? Human minds are made up of numerous psychological mechanisms that guide our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Psychology is basically what you're thinking about, what you're feeling, and how you behave. That's psychology, right? So we are basically, our psychology derives from these psychological mechanisms that I'll explain as we go along here. The mechanisms have pretty much been designed by natural as well as sexual selection, and thus are linked to heritable genes and to survival and reproductive advantages. Genes directly or indirectly influence our psychology, right? Our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by genes. The alleles or the genes that are somehow associated with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that lead to better survival and reproduction are the ones that get passed down over the generations. If you have genes that basically make you do something that hurts your survival, hurts your reproduction, over time, that won't be passed down. Another way to look at it is to say that our psychology consists of information processors, many, many information processors, thousands of subroutines or little apps, mini apps, so to say. And these apps or subroutines were basically naturally selected over millions of years because they somehow processed information. They took in input from the environment, environmental cues, very specific environmental cues, processed them according to some kind of decision rule, some kind of if-then statement, and then produces output. And the output is an adaptive response. It's a feeling, a thought, or behavior, more likely, that somehow helped us survive or reproduce. For humans, one of the energy obtaining mechanisms that we have is basically an if-then statement that says, if it's sweet, prefer and eat it. That got us to eat things like ripe fruit. When fruit is ripe, it has the most amount of sugar, calories, right? And vitamins as well. It gets us to eat fruit, berries, honey, things that are naturally occurring that have sugar in it. The catch is this. Our psychological mechanisms, which evolved over the Pleistocene era, this is a span of about 2 or so million years. Well, these psychological mechanisms evolved over this period of time in this kind of environment, but they have not kept up with all the rapidly changing conditions in recent times, because in recent times, the environment has changed so quickly that we have not had time to evolve any kind of response to these things. So we're basically using old software. We're using software from a million years ago, from at least 12,000 years ago, potentially. But certainly, in the last 10, 50, 100 years, things have really picked up very quickly, right? So now the modern world that we live in is very different from the ancestral world in which our psychological mechanisms developed and evolved. So we're left with a situation called evolutionary mismatch. Our current living conditions are mismatched to the psychological mechanisms, to the software, to the apps that are running in our heads, because these really haven't been updated. The only way to really update them truly is to go through the evolutionary process, which cannot happen overnight in a matter of 10 years like this, not within one generation. But the problem is now we have evolutionarily novel inputs, new things that are mechanisms never encountered. When the designer of the software here, the evolutionary process, was making all these apps and things for us, right? We didn't have these things that we have now in the modern world. So they're now feeding into our mechanisms, our decision rules, our apps, and producing potentially maladaptive output, an output that is also potentially undesirable. Look at our food example, right? We still have the same if it's sweet, prefer and eat it mechanism. That's what we all like to do. But the inputs have changed. We have manufactured things now, not just naturally occurring things that are feeding into these mechanisms, right? So this mechanism says eat sweet things, and it gets us now to not eat the fruit and the berries and the honey, but instead to prefer candy, soda, processed and highly sugared foods. But now we're overloading them with vastly increased amounts of sugar, feeding into these same mechanisms, causing these mechanisms to malfunction and lose their ability to regulate our energy, and we are left with diabetes and things like this. Sometimes evolutionary mismatch can lead to more psychological discomfort, the kind of things that we were talking about earlier, meaning more negative emotions, moods, and other psychological states. So for instance, we have a social comparison mechanism, right? When people tell you, hey, just be content, don't compare yourself with other people. Well, that's nice advice, but it's a little misguided because ultimately we have a mechanism that gets us to socially compare ourselves. We can't help it. We do that because we want to, the mechanisms help us reproduce and survive by adaptively aligning your self-esteem. This was adaptive and manageable in the old settings. The old settings, we used to live in small villages, small kampongs of no more than, let's say, 150 people. But nowadays, what happens is that we have virtual people that we're comparing with, movie stars, right? Magazine people, internet people. But we have the same mechanism. It has not adjusted. Even though we know that the people on TV are fake, that the people in magazine are like, these aren't really our peers. These are just like, stars or models or whatever, right? But our brain doesn't know the difference. Our brain is still processing these things and comparing ourselves, which produces discomforting output. We feel unattractive, self-dissatisfied. So here are some of the evolutionarily novel inputs that we're dealing with today. These things alone should be causing a lot of issues because these are things that are different, much different than how the environment was when our mechanisms evolved. Okay? So population density has increased in some cases by 10,000 times, right? That must be having an effect. Global competition, right? We're dealing not just like trying to beat the guy next door or the next hut, but we're trying to beat everybody in the entire world because any moment you could be replaced by somebody better from somewhere else in the world. So some of the implications I want to just quickly mention. The more we alter our environments, the more mismatch is created, the more difficulties we will have. And this is something that people are fond of doing in the modern world, is to throw more technology at treating the difficulties caused by problems that we created with technology to begin with. Okay? And so when you do that, you're just compounding the problems, making them even worse, or creating new ones. Addressing the problems effectively, which is what we ultimately want to do, right, is going to require understanding how the psychological mechanisms work. Right? If your car is broken, you want to figure out how this is designed, how it's built. We need to work with those mechanisms rather than against them, or rather than in complete ignorance of them. Sustainability is a big issue these days. We want to induce more sustainable behavior in citizens and in people around the world, right? The problem is that we are also constrained because, okay, we don't actually have mechanisms for sustainability because our ancestors for millions of years didn't really have to worry about that. there weren't enough humans and enough technology to cause problems like damaging the whole world. It's not to say that it's impossible to do. It's just to say that it's a more difficult problem than it appears. We do have a propensity for self-interest. We do have a motivation for relative rather than absolute status. We want to be better than other people, not everybody to be equally good. We have a proclivity to unconsciously copy others, okay? We have a predisposition to be short-sighted. We don't usually think about 50 years from now or 2 generations or next generation from now, and sometimes not even next year. We are prone to disregard impalpable concerns, things that are not tangible. So in order to solve these problems and get people to work on things like sustainable behavior, sustainability, we have to take these kind of constraints in mind, which are part of our psychological mechanisms.